What if I told you that the most critical decision in a Fortune 500 company's history wasn't made by someone with an MBA from Wharton, but by a veteran who used to mop those same boardroom floors just hours before dawn? What if the person who prevented a corporate disaster that could have cost thousands of jobs spoke not with executive authority, but with the steady resolve that comes from knowing what it means to protect people when everything is falling apart? This is the story of Daniel Rodriguez, a story that will shatter everything you think you know about where real leadership comes from when the stakes are highest. Because sometimes the person who saves the day is the one who was never supposed to be in the room in the first place. Before we dive into Daniel's extraordinary journey, from invisible to indispensable, if stories of unexpected heroism and quiet courage speak to your soul, show some love by hitting that like button. Your support means everything to creators who believe in sharing these powerful human stories. And if you're ready to discover more tales that prove heroism doesn't always come with a corner office, subscribe to join our growing community of people who understand that real strength often wears the most humble uniforms. Trust me, what unfolds in Daniel's story will challenge every assumption you have about corporate power, military service, and the kind of person who steps up when everything is on the line. This isn't just another feel-good story about someone getting promoted. This is about a moment when experience, integrity, and split-second decision-making meant the difference between corporate survival and complete catastrophe. Daniel Rodriguez had spent 15 years perfecting the art of being a ghost in a world of giants. At 42, he moved through the marble corridors of Titan Financial Group's Manhattan headquarters like morning mist, his industrial cleaning cart gliding silently across polished floors that reflected the city lights 40 stories below. He had learned to read the pulse of this corporate cathedral, understanding its rhythms better than executives who earned in a day what he made in 6 months. Every morning at 4:30, Daniel's alarm pierced the darkness of his studio apartment in Queens. By 5:15, he was crossing the Queensboro Bridge in his 15-year-old Honda Civic, watching the sun paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and amber. The city never slept, but it dozed fitfully between 3 and 6 a.m., and that's when Daniel did his most important work, preparing these temples of commerce for another day of million-dollar decisions. He knew every executive's schedule by heart, not from any official roster, but from months of careful observation. He knew that Rebecca Chen from Corporate Strategy always arrived at 6:45 with a large coffee and a everything bagel. He knew that Marcus Thompson from Risk Management stayed late every Tuesday to call his daughter in California. He knew that Sarah Williams from Legal paced the halls when she was working through complex cases, her heels clicking against marble in patterns that revealed her stress levels. But most importantly, Daniel knew the building itself. He knew which elevator made that subtle grinding noise that meant the cables needed adjustment. He knew which conference room's air conditioning unit vibrated in a way that suggested the mounting bolts were loosening. He knew the difference between the normal settling sounds of a skyscraper and the subtle warnings that indicated potential problems. These weren't just the observations of a careful cleaner. They were the instincts of someone who had spent 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, where noticing small details could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic failure, where understanding systems, infrastructure, and human behavior under pressure wasn't academic knowledge, but survival skill. Daniel's military service had ended not with fanfare or ceremony, but with an improvised explosive device on a road outside Kandahar that left him with a titanium rod in his left leg and nightmares that visited him most Tuesday nights. The army had trained him to build bridges, clear obstacles, and keep critical infrastructure functioning under impossible conditions. But civilian life seemed to have no use for those skills, at least not for someone whose college education had been interrupted by deployment, and whose resume showed more time in desert fatigues than business suits. The transition from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez to Daniel, the night cleaner, hadn't been a choice so much as a necessity. The GI Bill was covering his slow progress toward an engineering degree at Queen's Community College, but bills didn't wait for graduation. The cleaning job at Titan Financial paid enough to cover rent and tuition, and the night shift meant he could attend morning classes without conflict. What nobody knew, what Daniel had never mentioned on any job application or casual conversation, was that his 8 years in the Corps of Engineers had included 3 deployments and specialized training in crisis management, structural assessment, and emergency response coordination. He could read building schematics like sheet music, could assess load-bearing capacity by sound and vibration, and had once coordinated the evacuation of a forward operating base when intelligence indicated an imminent mortar attack. But that was a different life, a different Daniel. Here in the halls of Titan Financial, he was just the guy who emptied trash cans and mopped floors, invisible to the titans of industry who made decisions that moved markets and shaped economies. He wore navy blue coveralls with Rodriguez embroidered over the left pocket, carried keys to every room in the building, and possessed security clearance that allowed him access to spaces where billion-dollar deals were crafted. The irony wasn't lost on him. In Afghanistan, he had been responsible for keeping entire bases operational, for ensuring that critical infrastructure functioned under enemy fire. Here, he was responsible for keeping conference tables dust-free and making sure the coffee stations were stocked with cream and sugar. The skills were transferable, but the respect wasn't. Daniel had made peace with this reality, or thought he had. He found purpose in the work itself, in the quiet satisfaction of maintaining order in a chaotic world. There was dignity in keeping spaces clean and functional, in being the invisible foundation upon which visible success was built. His supervisor, Maria Santos, appreciated his reliability and attention to detail. His co-workers respected his quiet competence and his willingness to cover extra shifts when someone called in sick. But sometimes, during the pre-dawn hours when he was alone with the hum of climate control systems and the distant murmur of traffic, 40 floors below, Daniel wondered what would have happened if that IED had missed, if he had completed his tour and returned to finish his engineering degree on schedule. Would he be one of the executives whose offices he now cleaned? Would he be making decisions instead of sweeping up after the people who made them? The closest Daniel came to that old life was during his Tuesday and Thursday evening classes at Queen's Community College, where he was slowly working toward completing his degree in civil engineering. Professor Martinez, herself a veteran who had served in the Navy, recognized something in Daniel that others missed. She saw how quickly he grasped complex engineering concepts, how his questions revealed practical experience that went far beyond textbook knowledge. "You're not like the other students," she had told him after class one evening. "You ask questions like someone who's actually had to make these calculations under pressure, like someone who's seen what happens when engineering theory meets real-world crisis." Daniel had simply nodded and thanked her for the feedback, but he hadn't elaborated. Civilian life seemed to have an unspoken rule that military experience was something to be grateful for in the abstract, but not particularly relevant to the daily business of corporate America. Better to be known as a reliable cleaner than a veteran struggling to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. So Daniel maintained his routine, arriving before dawn, working through the early morning hours, attending classes when his schedule allowed, and returning home to his small apartment where he studied engineering textbooks and occasionally video-called his sister in San Antonio, who worried that he was wasting his potential cleaning floors when he could be building bridges. What Daniel didn't know, couldn't have known, was that his careful observation of corporate rhythms and building systems was about to intersect with a crisis that would test every skill he had learned in 8 years of military service. What he didn't know was that sometimes the most important qualifications for leadership aren't listed on any resume, and that the person best equipped to handle a disaster might be the one everyone assumes is just there to empty the trash cans. The universe has a way of placing the right person in the right place at precisely the moment when their unique combination of skills, experience, and character becomes not just useful, but essential. For Daniel Rodriguez, that moment was approaching, faster than anyone could have anticipated, disguised as nothing more than a simple mistake about which conference room he was supposed to clean. The pre-dawn hours at Titan Financial Group belonged to Daniel Rodriguez in ways that daylight never could. While Manhattan slept fitfully outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Daniel moved through the executive floors with the precision of someone who understood that invisible work was often the most critical work. His cartwheels whispered across marble floors that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month, but Daniel had long since stopped calculating the mathematics of inequality that surrounded him. Each night brought its own rhythm, its own subtle variations that only someone attuned to the building's heartbeat would notice. Tonight felt different, though Daniel couldn't immediately pinpoint why. The climate control system hummed at a slightly higher frequency, suggesting the building's environmental engineers were compensating for something unusual. The security desk in the lobby had been staffed by Jenkins instead of Rodriguez's usual contact. Martinez and Jenkins had seemed more alert than typical for a Wednesday. Night shift, Daniel's rounds followed a pattern perfected over 3 years of employment at Titan Financial. He started with the common areas, lobbies, break rooms, bathways, before moving to the individual offices of analysts, managers, and directors. The executive floor was always last, partly because it required the highest security clearance and partly because it demanded the most careful attention to detail. These weren't just offices. They were command centers where decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of investors were made daily. The 38th floor housed the offices of senior vice presidents, people whose names appeared in financial publications and whose decisions rippled through markets. Daniel knew their habits, their schedules, their quirks. Victoria Chang, in strategic planning, always left her desk immaculately organized except for one stack of papers that she apparently used as a stress outlet, shuffling and reshuffling them when wrestling with complex problems. Robert Kim, in mergers and acquisitions, had a habit of leaving coffee cups in increasingly remote locations around his office, as if he forgot where he had set them down while pacing during phone calls. But it was the details that others missed that made Daniel valuable, in ways his job description could never capture. He noticed when someone's routine changed, when stress patterns shifted, when the normal flow of corporate life indicated underlying turbulence. Last week, he had observed unusual activity in the legal department. Late-night meetings, increased document shredding, and conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered rooms to empty trash cans. Military experience had taught him that changes in routine often preceded significant events, though in corporate America, those events usually involved reorganizations, acquisitions, or regulatory investigations rather than enemy attacks. Tonight's difference became clearer as Daniel worked his way through the 38th floor. Several offices showed signs of having been occupied much later than usual. Sarah Peterson from Risk Management had apparently worked until after midnight, judging by the cold coffee cup and the dinner container from the Thai restaurant downstairs. Michael Torres from compliance had left his computer on overnight, which violated company policy and suggested he had been too distracted or exhausted to follow normal shutdown procedures. But the real anomaly was on the 39th floor, where the C-suite executives maintained their domain. Daniel's access to this level was strictly regulated. He could only clean these offices between 4 and 6 a.m., and only after security had verified that no sensitive meetings were scheduled. Tonight, security had cleared him for normal cleaning, but as Daniel stepped off the elevator, he immediately sensed something unusual. The hallway, that normally lay in energy-saving semi-darkness, was fully illuminated. The conference room at the end of the hall, Conference Room 3901, known informally as the War Room for its role in crisis management, showed light leaking from beneath its doors. Daniel checked his watch. 4:47 a.m. In 3 years of working. This floor, he had never seen the war room occupied during cleaning hours. Daniel's military training kicked in automatically. Unexpected activity in secured areas during unusual hours could indicate anything from a late-running meeting to a security breach. His first instinct was to contact building security, but he remembered that Jenkins was new and might not understand the significance of what Daniel was observing. The regular security supervisor, Martinez, would have known immediately that something unusual was happening. Moving closer to Conference Room 3901, Daniel could hear voices through the heavy oak doors. The conversation was too muffled to make out specific words, but the tone was urgent, tense, with the overlapping speech patterns that indicated multiple participants in a high-stakes discussion. These weren't the casual tones of people working late on routine business. This was the sound of crisis management, of people grappling with problems that couldn't wait for normal business hours. Daniel's engineering background had taught him to analyze systems under stress, to identify failure points before they became catastrophic. His military experience had taught him to recognize when normal protocols were insufficient for abnormal situations. Both skill sets were now telling him that whatever was happening in Conference Room 3901 was significant enough to warrant unprecedented security measures. The cleaning schedule called for Daniel to work around any occupied conference rooms, returning later if necessary to complete his duties. But as he stood in the hallway, listening to the urgent voices and observing the unusual security posture, Daniel realized that he was witnessing something that might be historically significant for Titan Financial Group. The combination of late night, crisis meetings and heightened security suggested that the company was facing a threat serious enough to activate emergency protocols. Daniel had seen enough crisis situations to recognize the signs. In Afghanistan, intelligence briefings had the same urgent undertone when friendly forces were facing imminent threats. Emergency response coordinations had the same overlapping conversation patterns when multiple agencies were trying to coordinate complex solutions under time pressure. Whatever was happening behind those oak doors, it was serious enough to pull senior executives out of their beds in the middle of the night. The question was whether Daniel should simply note the unusual activity and continue with his cleaning routine, or whether his observations warranted some form of action. In the military, unusual activity in secured areas during off hours would trigger immediate investigation and reporting up the chain of command. But this was corporate America, where the chain of command was less clear and where a night cleaner's observations might be dismissed as irrelevant speculation. Daniel decided to continue his cleaning route while maintaining awareness of the situation in Conference Room 3901. If the meeting was still active when he finished the rest of the 39th floor, he would reassess and potentially contact his supervisor to report the unusual activity. Military protocol emphasized the importance of documentation and proper reporting channels, habits that had served Daniel well in civilian life. As he moved through the other offices on the 39th floor, Daniel's observations painted a picture of a company under significant stress. CEO Amanda Foster's office showed signs of hasty departure. Her jacket still hung on the back of her chair, and her computer remained on, with documents still open on the screen. CFO David Chen's office contained financial reports scattered across, his desk in patterns that suggested urgent analysis rather than routine review. The office of Chief Operating Officer Lisa Park contained the most telling evidence of crisis. Her whiteboard, normally used for strategic planning sessions, was covered with what appeared to be contingency scenarios. Daniel could make out fragments: liquidity options, regulatory response, media strategy, and employee communications. These weren't the routine planning elements of normal business operations. They were the crisis management frameworks that companies activated when facing existential threats. Daniel's engineering background allowed him to read these indicators like symptoms of system failure. Just as a bridge showed stress fractures before collapse, and just as electrical systems displayed warning signs before catastrophic failure, corporate organizations exhibited predictable patterns when facing serious threats. The evidence scattered across the 39th floor suggested that Titan Financial Group was dealing with a crisis serious enough to activate its highest-level emergency protocols. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel that his military experience in crisis assessment was proving relevant in ways his engineering education never had. In Afghanistan, he had learned to read terrain, infrastructure, and human behavior for signs of danger. Here in corporate Manhattan, those same analytical skills were revealing patterns that suggested Titan Financial Group was facing threats that could determine its survival. As Daniel completed his cleaning of the individual offices, the voices from conference room 3901 continued. The urgency hadn't diminished, and if anything, the conversation seemed to have intensified. Daniel could occasionally make out individual voices rising above the general discussion, suggesting that whatever decisions were being made involved significant disagreement among senior leadership. Military experience had taught Daniel that crisis meetings followed predictable patterns. Initial briefings established the scope and urgency of the threat. Situation assessments identified available resources and potential response options. Decision-making processes weighed risks and benefits of various courses of action. Implementation planning assigned responsibilities and established timelines for action, based on the duration and intensity of the conversation he was observing. Daniel estimated that the senior leadership team was somewhere in the decision-making phase of crisis response. This suggested that they had moved beyond simply assessing the threat and were now grappling with difficult choices about how to respond. The level of disagreement he was hearing suggested that the available options were all problematic in different ways. Daniel finished cleaning the last office on his list and found himself back in the hallway outside conference room 3901. The meeting was still active, and Daniel now faced a decision about how to proceed. His cleaning checklist called for him to sanitize and organize conference room 3901, but clearly that was impossible while the room was occupied. Normal protocol would be to skip the room and return during the next shift, but Daniel's instincts told him that whatever was happening inside might be too important for routine postponement. As he stood in the hallway, debating whether to knock and request access or simply move on to the next floor, Daniel heard something that changed everything. A voice he recognized as belonging to CEO Amanda Foster rose above the general conversation, carrying a tone of frustration and desperation that Daniel had heard before in very different circumstances. It was the same tone he had heard from commanding officers when intelligence indicated imminent threats and available response options were inadequate. It was the voice of leadership facing impossible choices with insufficient resources and running out of time. It was the sound of someone who needed help but wasn't sure where to find it. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway, his hand hovering over his cleaning cart, realizing that he was about to make a decision that would either be completely insignificant or completely life-changing. Military training had taught him that sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as routine situations that suddenly demanded extraordinary responses. Daniel's hesitation in the hallway outside conference room 3901 stretched into what felt like an eternity, but lasted only seconds. The voices inside had grown more strained, more urgent, and he found himself unconsciously leaning closer to the door, his military instincts overriding his civilian caution. What he heard next would have been incomprehensible to most people, but to someone who had spent 8 years managing crisis situations under pressure, the fragments of conversation painted a clear and alarming picture. "The structural integrity reports are worse than we thought," came a voice Daniel recognized as belonging to David Chen, the chief financial officer. "If the Foundation investigation reveals what we suspect, we're looking at a complete evacuation scenario for the downtown complex. That's 15,000 employees across 6 buildings. Daniel's engineering background made his blood run cold. Structural integrity issues in a major corporate complex weren't just business problems. They were life safety emergencies. His mind immediately began processing the implications. Evacuation procedures, structural assessment protocols, emergency response coordination. These were exactly the kinds of crisis management situations he had trained for in the Army Corps of Use. Engineers. The geological survey confirms what Rodriguez warned us about 18 months ago, continued another voice that Daniel identified as Lisa Park, the chief operating officer. "The subsurface conditions are deteriorating faster than anyone predicted. We're not talking about minor foundations settling anymore. We're talking about potential catastrophic failure." The name Rodriguez caught Daniel's attention, not because it was his surname, Rodriguez was common enough, but because someone named Rodriguez had apparently been providing warnings about structural issues that were now proving prophetic. Daniel wondered if this Rodriguez was an engineer, a consultant, or perhaps a whistleblower who had tried to raise concerns through proper channels. Rodriguez's preliminary assessments were dismissed by our consulting firm as overly conservative. Came the voice of Amanda Foster, the CEO. Now Pemberton and Associates are admitting that their analysis was flawed. They're recommending immediate evacuation of buildings 3 and 4, with comprehensive structural reinforcement required before any reoccupancy. Daniel's mind raced as he processed this information. Someone named Rodriguez had identified structural problems that consulting firms had dismissed, and now those problems were proving serious enough to require emergency evacuation procedures. The irony that he, another Rodriguez with relevant engineering expertise, was standing outside the door while they discussed crisis management wasn't lost on him. "The regulatory implications alone could shut us down," David Chen's voice carried. "The weight of someone calculating catastrophic financial exposure. OSHA will launch a full investigation. The SEC will want to know why we didn't disclose the structural risks to shareholders. We're looking at lawsuits from every tenant in the complex. And if we evacuate now, before the investigation is complete, we're essentially admitting liability." Lisa Park's voice revealed the impossible choice facing senior leadership. "But if we don't evacuate and something happens to those 15,000 people..." The conversation trailed off into silence, the kind of heavy quiet that settles over people when they realize they're facing decisions where every option leads to disaster. Daniel had experienced similar moments in Afghanistan, when intelligence reports painted scenarios where action and inaction were equally dangerous. What about Rodriguez's contingency recommendations? Amanda Foster's voice cut through the silence. His original report included emergency response protocols. Maybe we missed something in our rush to dismiss his concerns. "Rodriguez isn't returning our calls," came David Chen's bitter response. "Apparently he's moved to Seattle after we ignored his warnings. His consulting firm says he's working on private contracts now and won't discuss Titan Financial Group matters." Daniel felt a chill of recognition. The Rodriguez they were discussing was clearly a structural engineer who had identified problems that Titan Financial Group's leadership had chosen to ignore. Now they were facing exactly the kind of crisis he had warned them about, and the expert who might be able to help them navigate the emergency was unreachable. "We need someone who understands both structural engineering and emergency response coordination." Lisa Park's voice carried desperation. "Someone who can assess the situation and help us develop evacuation procedures that protect lives while minimizing regulatory exposure." At 4:30 in the morning? David Chen's skepticism was evident. "Even if we could find someone with those qualifications, by the time we brief them on the situation and get them up to speed, we could be looking at structural failure during peak occupancy hours." Daniel stood frozen in the hallway, his mind processing the cruel irony of the situation. Inside conference room 3901, senior executives were desperately searching for expertise in structural engineering and emergency response coordination. Outside, in the hallway, Daniel Rodriguez, a veteran of the Army Corps of Engineers with 8 years of experience in exactly those specialties, was debating whether to continue cleaning floors or find the courage to offer help. His military experience had taught him that crisis situations demanded immediate action, but his civilian experience had taught him that corporate hierarchies didn't welcome unsolicited input from night janitors. The gap between what he knew he could contribute and what the corporate world expected from someone in his position felt insurmountable. "What about bringing in FEMA?" came a new voice that Daniel didn't immediately recognize. "If this is truly an emergency situation affecting 15,000 people, maybe we need federal emergency management coordination." FEMA involvement means federal oversight, media attention, and congressional investigations. Amanda Foster's voice carried the weight of someone who understood political implications. "We'll go from a corporate crisis to a national news story. Our stock price will collapse before we even know if the structural problems are actually dangerous." Daniel's engineering background helped him understand the complexity of their situation. Structural problems in major buildings required immediate assessment, but premature evacuation could cause financial catastrophe for no reason. Emergency response protocols needed to balance life safety with economic reality, and that balance required expertise that combined technical knowledge with practical experience. The geological reports show accelerating subsidence in the southwest quadrant. David Chen's voice took on the mechanical tone of someone reading technical data. "If the foundation piers in that section fail, we're looking at progressive collapse scenarios that could affect the entire complex." Progressive collapse was a term that made Daniel's blood pressure spike. In his military training, progressive collapse scenarios were nightmare situations where the failure of one structural element triggered cascading failures throughout an entire building system. These weren't theoretical engineering problems. They were life and death emergencies that required immediate expert intervention. Rodriguez's original assessment identified the southwest quadrant as the highest risk area. Lisa Park's voice carried bitter recognition. His recommendations included emergency monitoring systems and phased occupancy restrictions for that section. We implemented none of them. Daniel realized with growing clarity that the Rodriguez they were discussing had provided exactly the kind of comprehensive crisis planning that Daniel himself had learned to develop during his military service. Structural assessment, risk evaluation, emergency response protocols, and phased implementation strategies were standard components of military engineering operations. "We need to make a decision in the next hour." Amanda Foster's voice cut through the technical discussion with executive authority. "Either we implement emergency evacuation procedures before the morning shift arrives, or we risk having 15,000 people in potentially unstable buildings during peak occupancy." Emergency evacuation without proper coordination could cause panic casualties, came the unidentified voice again. "We need someone who can design evacuation procedures that move people safely without creating stampede conditions." Daniel's military experience included extensive training in exactly this type of emergency coordination. Military bases faced evacuation scenarios regularly: incoming mortar attacks, chemical threats, structural damage from explosions. The Army Corps of Engineers specialized in developing evacuation procedures that balanced speed with safety, moving large numbers of people efficiently without creating dangerous crowd dynamics. The insurance implications are staggering either way. David Chen's voice revealed another layer of the crisis. "If we evacuate based on preliminary assessments and the buildings prove stable, we're liable for business interruption costs. If we don't evacuate and someone gets hurt, we're facing wrongful death lawsuits." "This isn't about insurance." Amanda Foster's voice carried a tone of moral clarity that cut through the financial calculations. "This is about 15,000 people who trust us to provide them with safe working environments. If there's any real risk of structural failure, we evacuate immediately." Daniel felt a moment of respect for the CEO's willingness to prioritize human safety over financial considerations. But he also recognized that good intentions without proper expertise could lead to evacuation procedures that caused more harm than help. Poorly managed emergency evacuations could result in injuries, deaths, and panic that spread far beyond the immediate area. "We need expertise we don't have." Lisa Park's voice summarized the impossible situation facing Titan Financial Group's leadership. "We need someone who understands structural engineering, emergency response, regulatory compliance, and crisis communications. We need someone who can help us make decisions that protect lives without destroying the company." Daniel stood in the hallway, listening to senior executives describe exactly the kind of crisis management expertise he had spent 8 years developing in military service. The irony was overwhelming. They were desperately searching for help that was standing just outside their door, but corporate hierarchy and social assumptions made it impossible for them to recognize the solution to their crisis. His hand moved, unconsciously, to the identification badge clipped to his coveralls. "Daniel Rodriguez, Facilities Services," it read in simple black letters on white plastic. Nothing on that badge indicated his military service, his engineering education, or his experience managing exactly the kind of emergency they were facing. To the executives inside conference room 3901, he was invisible infrastructure, as unremarkable and reliable as the climate control systems that kept the building comfortable. But Daniel's military training had taught him that sometimes the most important contributions came from unexpected sources, and that crisis situations demanded action regardless of conventional protocol. As he listened to the growing desperation in the voices inside the conference room, Daniel realized that he was facing a moment that would define not just his own future, but potentially the safety of 15,000 people. The question was no longer whether he had the expertise to help. He knew he did. The question was whether he had the courage to step forward and offer that expertise, knowing that doing so would forever change his relationship with invisibility and force him to claim a place in a world that had never made room for people like him. The moment of decision arrived, with the sharp crack of a chair being pushed back violently inside conference room 3901. Daniel heard footsteps pacing across the hardwood floor, the sound of someone who had reached the limits of patience and needed physical movement to process stress. The pacing was irregular, agitated, suggesting that whoever was moving had been pushed beyond their normal coping mechanisms. "We're out of time." Amanda Foster's voice cut through the silence with the finality of someone who had weighed all options and found them inadequate. "The morning shift starts arriving in 2 hours. Building security reports that early arrivals are already badging into the parking garage. We can't delay this decision any longer." Daniel checked his watch. 5:23 a.m. In corporate Manhattan, the earliest employees, financial analysts, traders preparing for market opening, executives with West Coast calls, would begin arriving within the hour. Whatever decision Titan Financial Group's leadership made in the next few minutes would affect thousands of people who had no idea their workplace had become a potential death trap. "The preliminary engineering report is clear about one thing." David Chen's voice carried the weight of someone reading from technical documents. "The subsidence rates have accelerated beyond all previous projections. What Rodriguez predicted would take 18 months to become critical has happened in 6 months. Daniel's engineering background helped him understand the implications. Accelerated subsidence meant that the foundation systems were failing faster than calculated, creating unknown variables in structural stability. In military engineering, unknown variables in mission-critical systems meant immediate escalation to emergency protocols. The southwest quadrant is showing stress indicators that weren't present in last month's inspection." Lisa Park's voice revealed new information that made Daniel's pulse quicken. Hairline fractures in the foundation walls, separation at construction joints, and what the report calls concerning deflection patterns in the support beams. Concerning deflection patterns was engineering terminology for structural elements that were bending or shifting beyond acceptable tolerances. In Daniel's military experience, such patterns indicated imminent failure of load-bearing systems. Buildings displaying these symptoms required immediate evacuation and comprehensive structural support before any continued occupancy. Rodriguez's contingency planning included specific protocols for exactly this scenario. Amanda Foster's voice carried bitter recognition. Phased evacuation procedures that would minimize panic while ensuring rapid deployment of personnel. We dismissed his recommendations as unnecessarily complex. Daniel felt a surge of professional frustration on behalf of the Rodriguez, whose warnings had been ignored. In military engineering, contingency planning for structural failures was standard protocol precisely because emergency situations left no time for improvised solutions. Proper emergency response required advanced planning, established procedures, and trained personnel ready to implement coordinated evacuation protocols. The regulatory notification requirements alone could take hours to process, came the voice Daniel still couldn't identify. OSHA, city building inspectors, fire department coordination, police crowd control. By the time we worked through official channels, we could have 15,000 people in unstable buildings. But if we evacuate without proper regulatory notification, we're violating emergency management protocols. David Chen's response revealed the legal complexity of their situation. We could face federal charges for failure to coordinate with appropriate authorities during a public safety emergency. Daniel's military experience had taught him that crisis situations often created impossible choices between competing requirements. Emergency response demanded immediate action, but regulatory compliance required careful coordination with multiple agencies. Successful crisis management meant finding ways to satisfy both needs simultaneously, usually through parallel processing of emergency actions and regulatory notifications. The media implications are catastrophic either way. Lisa Park's voice revealed another dimension of the crisis. If we evacuate and the buildings prove stable, we look incompetent. If we don't evacuate and something happens, we look criminally negligent. There's no scenario where Titan Financial Group emerges from this crisis with its reputation intact. Reputation is irrelevant if people die. Amanda Foster's voice cut through the calculations with moral clarity. But we need evacuation procedures that actually protect people instead of creating new dangers. Panic evacuations kill people. Stampedes kill people. We need coordination that moves 15,000 people safely, not just quickly. Daniel stood in the hallway, listening to senior executives describe exactly the kind of emergency coordination challenge he had faced multiple times during his military service. Forward operating bases regularly conducted evacuation drills for incoming mortar attacks, chemical threats, and structural damage from explosions. The Army Corps of Engineers had developed sophisticated protocols for moving large numbers of people quickly and safely under extreme stress conditions. The techniques were transferable to civilian applications. Staged evacuation procedures that prevented bottlenecks at exit points, communication protocols that provided clear instructions without creating panic, coordination systems that ensured accountability for all personnel during emergency movements. Daniel had supervised evacuations of bases housing thousands of soldiers, and the principles that worked in combat zones would work in corporate environments. We need someone who can coordinate with building security, local emergency services, and regulatory authorities simultaneously. David Chen's voice outlined requirements that Daniel recognized from military emergency response training. Someone who understands both the technical aspects of structural failure and the practical logistics of large-scale evacuation. At 5:30 in the morning, where exactly do we find someone with those qualifications? Lisa Park's question carried the desperation of leadership facing an impossible timeline. Even if we could locate appropriate consultants, briefing them on the situation would take hours we don't have. Daniel realized with crystal clarity that he was listening to people describe exactly the expertise he possessed, exactly the experience he had gained through 8 years of military service, exactly the crisis management skills he had developed through deployment after deployment. The tragic irony was that the solution to their crisis was standing just outside their door, invisible to them because corporate hierarchies didn't recognize military experience as relevant to business challenges. The geological reports show continued degradation. Amanda Foster's voice took on the tone of someone making final preparations for unavoidable disaster. Even if we implement immediate evacuation, we're looking at months of structural assessment and remediation before any reoccupancy. This isn't a temporary closure. This is the potential end of Titan Financial Group's Manhattan operations. Daniel's engineering background helped him understand that structural problems of this magnitude represented existential threats to corporate operations. Losing access to major office complexes meant relocating thousands of employees, finding alternative workspace, maintaining business continuity during extended disruption. Companies had failed entirely from lesser logistical challenges. Rodriguez's original recommendations included alternative workspace strategies. Lisa Park's voice revealed that the dismissed engineer had provided comprehensive crisis planning beyond just structural assessment. Distributed operations protocols, remote work infrastructure, phased relocation procedures. We implemented none of it. The Rodriguez they were discussing had clearly understood that structural failures in major corporate facilities required not just emergency response, but comprehensive business continuity planning. Daniel recognized the systematic thinking that characterized good military engineering, identifying potential failure modes, developing response protocols, and creating contingency plans for extended operations under degraded conditions. We're going to have to brief the board of directors within the hour, David Chen's voice carried the weight of someone preparing for career-ending conversations. They're going to want explanations for how we ignored expert recommendations and allowed a manageable risk to become an existential crisis. The board meeting is the least of our problems. Amanda Foster's response revealed her understanding of priorities. We need to focus on immediate life safety issues. Everything else is secondary to ensuring that 15,000 people don't get hurt because we failed to take appropriate precautions. Daniel felt a moment of professional respect for the CEO's commitment to protecting human life over corporate considerations. But he also recognized that good intentions without proper expertise could lead to evacuation procedures that caused more casualties than they prevented. Emergency response required both moral commitment and technical competence. Building security reports unusual activity in the parking garage. Came a new voice that Daniel recognized as belonging to someone from the security department. Early arrivals are calling in reports of cracking sounds from the lower levels. The structural problems may be more advanced than the engineering reports indicated. Cracking sounds from parking garage levels were ominous indicators of foundation failure affecting load-bearing elements. In Daniel's experience, audible structural distress in foundation areas meant that failure modes were advancing beyond the capacity of engineering calculations to predict timing. Emergency evacuation was no longer a precautionary measure. It was becoming an immediate life safety necessity. That settles it. Amanda Foster's voice carried the authority of final decision. We implement emergency evacuation procedures immediately. I don't care about regulatory protocols or media coverage or board meetings. We get people out of those buildings now. Who's going to coordinate the evacuation? Lisa Park's question revealed the practical challenge of implementing emergency procedures without proper planning or trained personnel. Building security doesn't have experience with large-scale emergency coordination. We need someone who can manage 15,000 people under crisis conditions. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway, listening to senior executives acknowledge their desperate need for exactly the expertise he possessed. Military training had prepared him for precisely this kind of emergency coordination challenge, but corporate hierarchy made it impossible for them to recognize the solution standing just outside their door. The voices inside conference room 3901 grew more urgent as the magnitude of their situation became clear. They were facing an immediate life safety emergency affecting thousands of people, with no time to locate appropriate expertise through conventional channels. They needed someone who could coordinate complex emergency response procedures under extreme time pressure, and that someone needed to act immediately. Daniel's hand moved to the door handle of conference room 3901, his military training overriding his civilian caution. Crisis situations demanded action, regardless of protocol or hierarchy. 15,000 lives potentially hung in the balance, and he possessed the expertise that could make the difference between successful evacuation and catastrophic tragedy. As his fingers closed around the brass door handle, Daniel realized that he was about to cross a threshold that would forever change his relationship with invisibility. Opening that door meant claiming a place in a world that had never acknowledged his value, demanding recognition for expertise that corporate America had dismissed as irrelevant. But it also meant potentially saving thousands of lives, and that consideration outweighed every personal fear or professional hesitation. Daniel had sworn an oath as a soldier to protect people, and that oath didn't expire when he changed uniforms. From military fatigues to cleaning coveralls, taking a deep breath that felt like preparing for combat, Daniel turned the handle and stepped into conference room 3901, ready to offer his expertise to people who had never imagined that their salvation might come wearing a janitor's uniform. The brass door handle felt cold against Daniel's palm as he turned it slowly, his military training automatically engaging threat assessment protocols, even in this corporate environment. The soft click of the latch seemed to echo through the hallway like a gunshot, announcing his transition from invisible observer to active participant in a crisis that could define the fate of thousands of people. Conference room 3901 was larger than Daniel had imagined from his cleaning duties, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan's awakening skyline. But the beauty of the dawn view was lost on the 6 exhausted executives clustered around the mahogany conference table, their faces illuminated by the harsh glow of laptop screens and emergency lighting that had been activated for their crisis session. The moment Daniel stepped through the doorway, conversation stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance to outright hostility. These were people accustomed to controlling access to their discussions, and the appearance of a night janitor in coveralls disrupted every assumption they held about corporate hierarchy and appropriate boundaries. Amanda Foster, CEO of Titan Financial Group, was the first to speak. Her silver hair was disheveled from hours of running her hands through it, and her normally immaculate business attire showed wrinkles that spoke of a sleepless night spent wrestling with impossible decisions. "Excuse me," she said with the controlled patience of someone barely containing their frustration. "This is a private executive meeting. You'll need to come back later to clean this room." Daniel felt his throat constrict with the familiar sensation of being dismissed before he could speak, but his military training had taught him to push through discomfort when lives were at stake. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about structural failures and emergency evacuation procedures." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David Chen, the chief financial officer, leaned forward with barely controlled irritation. "Are you serious right now?" His voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had been pushed beyond their limits. "You were eavesdropping on confidential corporate discussions. Do you understand that what you've heard could constitute inside information that could land you in federal prison?" "I wasn't eavesdropping," Daniel replied, forcing himself to maintain eye contact despite every instinct telling him to retreat. "I was doing my job, cleaning the executive floor, when I heard you discussing emergency response coordination. The thing is, I have experience with exactly the kind of crisis you're facing." Lisa Park, the chief operating officer, let out a bitter laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. "Experience?" Her voice dripped with skepticism. "You're a knight. Janitor, what possible experience could you have with corporate emergency management or structural engineering?" Daniel felt the familiar weight of being judged by his uniform rather than his qualifications, but he pressed forward. 8 years, United States Army Corps of Engineers, he said simply. 3 deployments, specializing in structural assessment and emergency response coordination. We've managed evacuations for installations with populations larger than your employee base. The silence that followed his statement was different from the dismissive quiet that had greeted his entrance. This was the silence of people processing unexpected information, recalibrating their assumptions about someone they had written off as irrelevant. Daniel could see doubt warring with desperation in their faces as they struggled to reconcile his claims with their preconceptions. "Army Corps of Engineers," Amanda Foster repeated slowly, as if testing the words for authenticity. "You're saying you have actual training in structural failure assessment and large-scale evacuation coordination?" "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied, allowing a hint of his old military bearing to show through his civilian persona. "Forward Operating Base Kandahar, Forward Operating Base Salerno, Camp Liberty in Baghdad. Managed evacuation procedures for bases housing between 8,000 and 12,000 personnel under hostile conditions." Dr. Sarah Kim, whom Daniel now recognized as the head of risk management, spoke for the first time since his entrance. Hostile. Conditions meaning what exactly? Her voice carried professional skepticism mixed with genuine curiosity. Incoming mortar attacks, improvised explosive device threats, chemical alerts, structural damage from indirect fire. Daniel recited the list with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing routine workplace hazards. Emergency evacuation, under conditions where panic could kill more people than the original threat. The executives exchanged glances that Daniel couldn't interpret, but he sensed a shift in the room's dynamics. Desperation was beginning to overcome skepticism as they processed the possibility that the expertise they desperately needed might have literally walked through their door. "You said you overheard our discussion about Rodriguez's recommendations," David Chen said, his tone more measured now. "What's your assessment of the situation we're facing?" Daniel took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either establish his credibility or end his involvement in this crisis. "Based on what I heard, you're dealing with accelerated foundation subsidence in the southwest quadrant, stress indicators suggesting imminent structural failure, and a 15,000-person evacuation scenario with no established emergency protocols." He paused, letting his assessment sink in before continuing. "The Rodriguez who provided your original warnings was correct about everything. Phased evacuation procedures, regulatory coordination, business continuity planning, all of it should have been implemented months ago. Now you're facing an emergency evacuation with no time for proper planning. And what would you recommend?" Amanda Foster's question carried the weight of someone who had run out of conventional options and was willing to consider unconventional solutions. Daniel moved toward the conference table, his mind automatically shifting into crisis management mode. Immediate implementation of staged evacuation procedures designed to move large populations safely without creating panic conditions. Parallel coordination with emergency services and regulatory authorities. Establishment of accountability systems to ensure no personnel are left behind during evacuation. Lisa Park leaned back in her chair, studying Daniel with new interest. "You're talking about procedures that would normally take weeks to develop and implement. We have maybe an hour before peak occupancy begins. Military emergency response doesn't have the luxury of extended planning timelines," Daniel replied. "We develop procedures that can be implemented immediately using available resources and personnel. The key is understanding how to adapt standard protocols to specific facility characteristics and population dynamics." He gestured toward the windows overlooking the Titan financial complex. "Your buildings show classic urban high-rise characteristics with predictable traffic flow patterns. Multiple exit routes, emergency stairwells, parking garage access points. The infrastructure for safe evacuation exists. It just needs proper coordination." "What about regulatory compliance?" Dr. Kim asked. "We can't just evacuate 15,000 people without coordinating with city emergency services, OSHA, building inspectors, fire departments. Regulatory coordination happens in parallel with evacuation procedures," Daniel explained. "You don't wait for permission to save lives, but you notify appropriate authorities immediately and provide them with real-time updates on evacuation status. Military protocol emphasizes action first, documentation concurrent." David Chen pulled up building schematics on his laptop. "Assuming you're right about the procedures, how do we actually implement evacuation coordination with our existing security staff? They're not trained for this kind of emergency management." Daniel studied the building layouts, his engineering background helping him identify optimal traffic flow patterns and potential bottleneck areas. Existing security personnel become coordination points, not decision makers. They relay information and provide guidance, but evacuation success depends on clear communication protocols and established procedures that people can follow without complex instructions. Communication protocols meaning what? Amanda Foster asked, her executive mind focusing on practical implementation details. Simple, clear messaging that provides specific instructions without creating panic, Daniel replied. People need to know where to go, how to get there, and what to expect when they arrive. Vague announcements about emergency procedures create confusion and dangerous crowd dynamics. He pointed to specific locations on the building schematics. Staged evacuation means different floors evacuate in sequence, preventing overwhelming of exit routes. Ground floor and basement levels evacuate first because they're most vulnerable to structural failure. Upper floors evacuate in descending order to prevent bottlenecks in stairwells. Lisa Park was taking notes rapidly. What about accountability? How do we ensure everyone gets out safely? Buddy system protocols adapted to office environments, Daniel explained. Department heads become responsible for confirming evacuation of their immediate teams. Floor wardens, usually security or facilities personnel, confirm departmental accountability before declaring areas clear. And if the structural failure happens during evacuation? Dr. Kim's question addressed the nightmare scenario that was driving their urgency. Daniel's expression grew serious. Then proper evacuation procedures save lives instead of costing them. Panic kills more people than structural collapse in most emergency situations. Coordinated evacuation gives people the best chance of survival, regardless of timing. Amanda Foster stood and walked to the windows, looking down at the complex where thousands of her employees would soon be arriving for another ordinary workday. You're asking us to trust the safety of 15,000 people to procedures developed by someone we've known for 5 minutes? No, ma'am, Daniel replied quietly. You're trusting their safety to procedures developed by the United States Army over decades of emergency response experience. I'm just someone who knows how to implement those procedures in your specific situation. The room fell silent as the executives grappled with the magnitude of their decision. They could continue searching for conventional solutions that might not exist, or they could trust their crisis to someone who possessed exactly the expertise they needed, but came in a package they had never expected. What do you need from us? Amanda Foster asked, turning back from the windows with the expression of someone who had made a decision that could define her career and the lives of thousands of people. Daniel felt a surge of recognition that was part professional satisfaction and part overwhelming responsibility. Access to building security systems, communication with all department heads, and authorization to coordinate with emergency services. Most importantly, I need you to trust that procedures that work under hostile fire will work in corporate America. As the executives began implementing Daniel's recommendations, transforming from skeptical observers to active participants in emergency coordination, Daniel realized that he had just stepped across a threshold that separated his old life from something entirely new. The invisible night janitor had become the visible crisis manager, and there was no going back to the safety of anonymity. But as he watched Amanda Foster begin coordinating with building security and David Chen start drafting regulatory notifications, Daniel also realized that this was exactly what his military training had prepared him for. The uniforms were different. The stakes were corporate instead of military, but the fundamental challenge remained the same: protecting people when everything was falling apart. The transformation of Daniel's status from invisible janitor to emergency coordinator happened with the swift efficiency of military operations, but the corporate world's reaction to his sudden elevation was anything but smooth. Within 30 minutes of Amanda Foster's decision to implement his evacuation procedures, Daniel found himself at the center of a communication storm that revealed just how unprepared corporate America was for unconventional solutions to conventional problems. The first resistance came from Marcus Webb, Director of Corporate Security, who arrived at conference room 3901, looking like someone who had been awakened by an emergency call and dressed hastily in the dark. His security uniform was rumpled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his expression carried the barely controlled anger of someone whose authority had been undermined without consultation. "Ma'am?" Webb addressed Amanda Foster while pointedly ignoring Daniel's presence. "I need to understand why I'm receiving orders to implement evacuation procedures developed by someone who isn't on our emergency response roster. My team is asking questions I can't answer about why we're taking directions from facilities maintenance staff." Amanda Foster's response was crisp and decisive. "Mr. Rodriguez has relevant emergency management experience that we desperately need. Your team will coordinate with him to implement evacuation procedures that could save thousands of lives." Webb's face flushed with professional indignation. "With all due respect, ma'am, emergency management isn't something you improvise with untrained personnel. We have established protocols, regulatory requirements, chain of command procedures. We can't just hand over crisis coordination to someone because they claim to have military experience." Daniel felt the familiar sting of having his qualifications questioned, but his military training had taught him to focus on mission accomplishment rather than personal vindication. "Mr. Webb," he said quietly, "I understand your concerns about protocol. In military operations, we face the same tensions between established procedures and emergency adaptations. The difference is that crisis situations don't wait for perfect solutions. Military operations," Webb repeated with barely concealed skepticism. "And what rank did you hold in this alleged military service? What units? What actual command authority?" "Staff Sergeant, United States Army Corps of Engineers," Daniel replied, his voice taking on the crisp precision of military bearing. "8th Engineer Battalion, 1st Brigade Combat Team, 82nd Airborne Division. Forward Operating Base Kandahar. Forward Operating Base Salerno. Camp Liberty Baghdad. 3 deployments, 8 years active duty, emergency response coordination. 4 installations housing up to 12,000 personnel." The specificity of Daniel's response seemed to catch Webb off guard, but he recovered quickly. "Even assuming that's accurate, military experience doesn't translate to corporate emergency management. We're dealing with civilian populations, regulatory oversight, legal liability issues that don't exist in military environments." Lisa Park interrupted the developing confrontation with the urgency of someone watching time run out. "Gentlemen, we don't have time for credential verification. Building security is reporting increased structural distress indicators. We need to begin evacuation procedures immediately, regardless of who's coordinating them." But Webb's resistance had opened the floodgates for broader skepticism about Daniel's sudden elevation to crisis management authority. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Titan Financial Group's General Counsel, arrived shortly after Webb, her legal mind immediately focusing on liability issues created by unconventional emergency response procedures. "Amanda," she addressed the CEO with the familiar tone of someone who had provided legal guidance for years, "I need to understand the legal implications of placing emergency coordination authority in the hands of someone who isn't certified. For emergency management isn't bonded for this level of responsibility and whose qualifications we haven't independently verified. Patricia, we're facing potential structural collapse affecting 15,000 people." Amanda Foster's voice carried strained patience. "Legal liability is secondary to preventing casualties." "Legal liability is never secondary," Dr. Hendricks replied sharply. "If Mr. Rodriguez's procedures result in injuries or deaths, we're facing wrongful death lawsuits, negligence claims, regulatory sanctions that could destroy this company. We need certified emergency management professionals, not improvised solutions. From maintenance staff, Daniel found himself in the surreal position of listening to highly educated professionals debate his qualifications while a potential disaster ticked toward reality. The irony wasn't lost on him that people who had never managed an actual emergency were questioning the credentials of someone who had coordinated life-saving evacuations under hostile fire. "Dr. Hendricks," Daniel said, his voice calm despite the frustration building inside him. In military emergency response, we call this analysis paralysis, spending so much time verifying credentials that the emergency kills people while you're checking paperwork. Sometimes the choice isn't between perfect solutions and imperfect solutions. Sometimes it's between imperfect solutions and no solutions. That's exactly the kind of cowboy mentality that creates legal disasters. Dr. Hendricks shot back. Corporate emergency management requires documentation, certification, regulatory compliance. We can't just improvise procedures because someone claims military experience. The word claims hit Daniel like a physical blow, carrying all the dismissive skepticism he had faced since leaving military service. The implication that his 8 years of deployment, his Bronze Star for meritorious service, his combat action, badge earned under fire, were somehow fabricated to gain credibility in a corporate crisis felt like a betrayal of everything he had sacrificed in service to his country. David Chen looked up from his laptop, where he had been coordinating regulatory notifications. The OSHA emergency hotline is asking for credentials of our emergency coordinator. They want certification numbers, training documentation, professional references. They're not accepting military experience as adequate qualification for civilian emergency management. Amanda Foster's frustration was becoming visible as bureaucratic requirements collided with emergency timelines. What exactly do they want us to do? Wait for certified consultants to arrive while buildings potentially collapse with people inside? They want us to follow established emergency management protocols, Dr. Hendricks replied. Coordinate with city emergency services, implement our existing evacuation procedures, wait for professional emergency management teams to arrive and assess the situation. Our existing evacuation procedures are quarterly fire drills, Lisa Park said bitterly. We don't have protocols for large-scale structural failure evacuation. That's exactly why Rodriguez's original recommendations included comprehensive emergency planning that we ignored. Daniel watched the circular argument develop with growing alarm. Corporate bureaucracy was creating exactly the kind of decision paralysis that killed people in real emergencies. While executives debated credentials and liability, thousands of employees were arriving for work in potentially unstable buildings. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority he had learned to project during crisis situations. "While we're discussing my qualifications, building security reports that hairline cracks in the southwest foundation wall have widened visibly in the past hour. Structural failure isn't waiting for our bureaucratic processes." Webb looked skeptical. "How could you possibly know what building security is reporting? You don't have access to our emergency communication systems." Daniel pulled out his facility's radio, which had been crackling with increasingly urgent updates from security patrols. "Facilities maintenance has access to building security frequencies. I've been monitoring reports of structural distress, indicators for the past hour, while you've been debating whether I'm qualified to help." The radio crackled with a transmission that made everyone in the room freeze. "Central Command, this is Patrol 7. I'm seeing visible deflection in support beams on level B2. These beams are moving. Repeat. Support beams are showing active movement. I'm hearing what sounds like metal under stress." The transmission was followed by a sound that Daniel recognized from his military experience. the groaning of structural elements approaching failure. It was the same sound he had heard from damaged buildings in combat zones, the audible warning that preceded catastrophic collapse. Amanda Foster looked around the room at the faces of her senior staff, seeing her own recognition reflected in their expressions. The time for debate had ended. The crisis they had been discussing in theoretical terms was becoming immediate reality. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying the authority of final decision, "implement your evacuation procedures immediately. Mr. Webb, your security team will coordinate with Mr. Rodriguez. Dr. Hendricks, document everything for legal protection, but don't interfere with emergency operations." But Daniel's sudden authority created new challenges beyond simple bureaucratic resistance. The corporate hierarchy at Titan Financial Group wasn't designed to accommodate someone jumping from maintenance staff to crisis coordinator without passing through appropriate management levels. Department heads who had never heard of Daniel Rodriguez were suddenly receiving evacuation instructions from someone they assumed was a facilities worker, pretending to have authority he didn't possess. Jennifer Walsh, Senior Vice President of Human Resources, arrived at conference room 3901, looking like someone who had been pulled from her morning routine by inexplicable emergency communications. "Amanda, I'm getting calls from department heads asking why they're receiving evacuation orders from someone in facilities. They want to know if this is a drill, a real emergency, or some kind of administrative error." "It's a real emergency, and Mr. Rodriguez is coordinating our emergency response," Amanda Foster replied tersely. Walsh's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "With all due respect, emergency response coordination is an HR function. We have established procedures for employee safety, regulatory compliance, communication protocols. We can't just hand over HR responsibilities to someone from building maintenance." Daniel realized that his rapid elevation from invisible janitor to emergency coordinator was creating organizational chaos that could undermine evacuation effectiveness. People needed clear authority structures during emergencies, but corporate hierarchy was creating confusion about who was actually in charge of crisis coordination. "Ms. Walsh," Daniel said, "I'm not trying to replace HR functions. I'm providing technical expertise for emergency evacuation procedures. Your department maintains responsibility for employee communication, regulatory compliance, documentation. I'm just helping coordinate the physical logistics of moving people safely." But Walsh's concerns reflected broader organizational resistance to Daniel's unconventional authority. Middle managers throughout Titan Financial Group were receiving evacuation instructions from someone they didn't recognize, creating exactly the kind of communication breakdown that could turn coordinated evacuation into dangerous confusion. Radio crackled again with increasingly urgent reports. "Central Command, this is Patrol 12. I'm seeing cracks in the parking garage ceiling that weren't here an hour ago. These aren't hairline fractures, these are actual structural separations. I think we need to consider immediate evacuation of all underground levels." Daniel felt the familiar sensation of time accelerating during crisis situations. Military experience had taught him that emergency response operated on compressed timelines, where minutes could determine the difference between successful evacuation and catastrophic casualties. Corporate bureaucracy operated on extended timelines that allowed for consultation, documentation, and consensus building. The collision between emergency timelines and corporate processes was creating dangerous delays in evacuation implementation. While executives debated Daniel's authority and middle managers questioned his credentials, structural indicators suggested that building collapse was becoming increasingly imminent. "We need to stop arguing about who's in charge and start moving." "People," Daniel said, his military training overriding corporate diplomacy. "I don't care about organizational charts or management hierarchy. I care about getting 15,000 people out of buildings that are showing signs of imminent structural failure. Amanda Foster stood and addressed the room with the decisive authority that had made her CEO. Mr. Rodriguez is now our emergency coordinator with my full authority. Anyone who questions his instructions is questioning my direct orders. We implement evacuation procedures immediately, and we sort out organizational issues after we've ensured everyone's safety. As Daniel began coordinating the complex logistics of emergency evacuation, he realized that his biggest challenge wouldn't be the technical aspects of moving large populations safely. His biggest challenge would be overcoming organizational resistance to unconventional leadership during crisis situations. But as the building's distress indicators grew more urgent and time continued to compress, Daniel also realized that military training had prepared him for exactly this kind of leadership challenge. Sometimes saving lives required taking authority that wasn't formally granted, making decisions that weren't organizationally approved, and accepting responsibility for outcomes that others weren't willing to risk. The invisible janitor was about to become very visible indeed, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The first evacuation announcement went out at 6:47 a.m., just as the earliest employees were settling into their workstations with morning coffee and optimistic plans for a productive day. Daniel had insisted on crafting the message himself, drawing from military experience in communicating urgent information without creating panic. The announcement was broadcast simultaneously through the building's public address system, internal phone networks, and email systems to ensure comprehensive coverage. Attention all Titan Financial Group personnel. This is Amanda Foster, your CEO. Due to ongoing structural assessment of our buildings, we are implementing precautionary evacuation procedures effective immediately. This is not a drill. Please proceed calmly to your designated evacuation routes and follow instructions from floor wardens and security personnel. We expect this evacuation to be temporary, and we will provide updates as more information becomes available. The carefully neutral language was designed to convey urgency without triggering panic, but Daniel knew from military experience that initial communications were only as effective as the coordination systems that supported them. As he monitored radio traffic from building security, he could already hear the signs of organizational stress that preceded either successful crisis management or dangerous breakdown. Central Command, this is Floor Warden 12, came a voice, crackling with uncertainty. I've got about 200 people on this floor asking questions I can't answer. They want to know if this is related to the structural reports they've been hearing rumors about. They're asking if the buildings are actually dangerous or if this is just liability management. Daniel recognized the communication challenge that undermined most civilian emergency responses. Unlike military personnel who were trained to follow evacuation orders without extensive explanation, civilian employees had legitimate questions about emergency procedures that could either facilitate cooperation or create dangerous delays if not handled properly. Floor Warden 12, this is emergency coordination, Daniel responded, using radio protocols he had adapted from military operations. Inform personnel that evacuation is precautionary but necessary. Structural assessments indicate potential foundation issues that require immediate evacuation, while engineering teams conduct comprehensive safety evaluation. The response was professional and informative, but Daniel could hear skepticism in the floor warden's follow-up transmission. Emergency coordination. Personnel are asking about the authority structure for this evacuation. They want to know who's coordinating emergency response and what qualifications authorize these procedures. Daniel felt the familiar frustration of having his authority questioned during crisis situations, but he also recognized that credibility issues could undermine evacuation effectiveness if not addressed systematically. Military emergency response operated within established command structures where authority was clearly defined and rarely questioned. Corporate emergency response operated within much more ambiguous authority structures where employees retained the right to question instructions that seemed unusual or potentially dangerous. Floor Warden 12. Refer all authority questions to department heads or direct supervisors, Daniel replied. Our priority is personnel safety, not administrative clarification. Evacuation procedures are authorized by CEO Amanda Foster with coordination support from experienced emergency management personnel. But Daniel's carefully diplomatic language couldn't address the underlying organizational confusion created by his rapid elevation from maintenance staff to emergency coordinator. Throughout the Titan Financial Group complex, middle managers were fielding questions they couldn't answer about emergency procedures they didn't understand, coordinated by someone whose background they couldn't verify. Jennifer Walsh appeared at Daniel's improvised command station in conference room 3901, her face flushed with the stress of managing corporate communications during an unprecedented crisis. Daniel, I'm getting calls from department heads who are questioning whether this evacuation is legally authorized. They're concerned about liability issues if they order employees to leave work based on unverified emergency procedures. Ms. Walsh, Daniel replied while monitoring multiple radio frequencies simultaneously. Liability concerns are secondary to life safety during emergency situations. Department heads who delay evacuation to verify legal authorization are creating exactly the kind of decision paralysis that costs lives during real emergencies. But these aren't military personnel following military orders, Walsh shot back. These are civilian employees with rights to question emergency procedures that could affect their employment, their safety, their legal status. We can't just order people to evacuate without providing adequate justification. Daniel looked up from his radio coordination, his military experience helping him recognize the fundamental difference between civilian and military crisis management. Ms. Walsh, in military emergency response, we call this catastrophic overthinking, allowing legal and administrative concerns to override immediate safety requirements. The justification for evacuation is that buildings are showing signs of potential structural failure. Everything else is secondary. But Walsh's concerns reflected broader organizational resistance that was creating dangerous delays in evacuation implementation. Throughout the complex, employees were receiving mixed messages from supervisors who weren't sure whether evacuation orders were legitimate, creating exactly the kind of confusion that could turn coordinated emergency response into chaotic disaster. Radio crackled with increasingly urgent reports from building security patrols. Central Command, this is Patrol 15. I'm in the Southwest Foundation area, and I'm seeing active water infiltration through cracks that have opened in the past hour. The foundation wall is showing visible movement. I think we're looking at imminent failure in this section. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as military experience helped him recognize the signs of accelerating structural collapse. Water infiltration through foundation cracks indicated that underground systems were failing faster than engineering calculations had predicted. Buildings in this condition could experience sudden, catastrophic failure without additional warning. All stations, this is emergency coordination, Daniel broadcast on the primary security frequency. Structural indicators suggest accelerated failure timeline. Implement immediate evacuation of all underground levels and southwest quadrant. This is now a time-critical emergency. The radio response revealed the organizational chaos that Daniel's authority issues were creating throughout the emergency response. Emergency coordination. This is Patrol 7. I need confirmation of authority for immediate evacuation orders. My supervisor is asking for documentation of emergency coordinator credentials before implementing emergency procedures. Daniel felt a surge of disbelief that bordered on rage. While foundation walls showed visible movement and water infiltration indicated imminent collapse, security personnel were being instructed to verify paperwork before implementing life-saving procedures. The bureaucratic mentality that prioritized documentation over emergency action was creating exactly the kind of delay that killed people during real disasters. Patrol 7, this is CEO Amanda Foster, came Amanda's voice over the radio, her tone carrying absolute authority. Mr. Rodriguez has my complete authorization for emergency coordination. Any security personnel who delay evacuation to verify credentials will be held personally responsible for consequences. Implement immediate evacuation procedures now. But Amanda's intervention, while establishing Daniel's authority, also revealed the extent of organizational resistance he was facing. Throughout the Titan Financial Group complex, middle managers, department heads, and security personnel were struggling to reconcile their normal operational procedures with emergency requirements that seemed to come from nowhere and contradict established protocols. Marcus Webb appeared at Daniel's command station with the expression that mixed professional frustration with growing alarm about the situation they were all facing. Rodriguez, I've got department heads calling my security office asking whether this evacuation is real or some kind of corporate restructuring disguised as emergency procedure. They want to know if people who leave work today will still have jobs tomorrow. Daniel looked up from the building schematics he was using to coordinate evacuation routes, his mind struggling to process the corporate thinking that treated life safety as secondary to employment security. Mr. Webb, people who don't evacuate today might not be alive tomorrow. Employment status is irrelevant if the buildings collapse with people inside. But that's not how corporate employees think about emergency procedures, Webb replied. They're worried about whether this evacuation is being used to justify layoffs, whether leaving work voluntarily affects their employment status, whether this whole thing is some kind of corporate manipulation. Daniel realized with growing alarm that civilian emergency response was being undermined by social and economic factors that didn't exist in military operations. Soldiers evacuated when ordered, because military culture prioritized mission accomplishment and personnel safety over individual concerns. Corporate employees questioned evacuation orders because they had learned to be suspicious of management decisions that might affect their economic security. Mr. Webb, Daniel said, his voice taking on the firm authority he had learned to project during crisis coordination. We don't have time for corporate psychology analysis. We have buildings showing signs of imminent structural failure and 15,000 people who need to evacuate immediately. Everything else is secondary, but the corporate psychology issues Daniel was dismissing were creating real obstacles to evacuation effectiveness. Throughout the complex, employees were hesitating to leave their workstations because they weren't sure whether evacuation orders were legitimate, whether leaving work would affect their employment status, or whether the emergency was serious enough to justify abandoning their daily responsibilities. The radio crackled with reports that confirmed Daniel's worst fears about civilian emergency response. Central Command, this is Floor Warden 8. I've got approximately half my personnel questioning whether they should evacuate. They're asking whether this evacuation is mandatory or voluntary, whether they'll be paid for time away from work, whether they can return to collect personal items if the evacuation extends beyond today. Daniel felt the familiar sensation of time compressing during crisis situations. Military emergency response operated on assumptions that personnel would follow evacuation orders immediately and completely. Civilian emergency response apparently operated on assumptions that personnel had the right to evaluate emergency orders based on personal and economic considerations. Floor Warden 8, this is emergency coordination, Daniel replied, his voice carrying urgency that reflected his growing alarm about evacuation delays. Evacuation is mandatory and immediate. Personnel safety is the only consideration. All other questions will be addressed after evacuation is complete. But Daniel's military-style directive seemed to create more resistance rather than compliance. The radio filled with confused chatter from floor wardens and security personnel who were struggling to implement emergency procedures that conflicted with normal corporate culture and employee expectations. Jennifer Walsh reappeared at Daniel's command station with a tablet showing internal communications that revealed the scope of organizational confusion his authority was creating. "Daniel, I'm monitoring employee email and internal messaging systems. People are sending messages asking whether this evacuation is related to rumors about company bankruptcy, whether management is using fake emergencies to justify layoffs, whether this is some kind of corporate restructuring disguised as safety procedure." Daniel stared at the messages, his military experience providing no framework for understanding civilian responses that treated emergency evacuation as potentially manipulative rather than potentially life-saving. "Ms. Walsh, how do we convince people that this emergency is real without providing detailed technical information that could create panic?" "That's exactly the problem," Walsh replied. "Corporate employees have learned to be skeptical of management. Communications. They've seen too many emergency meetings that turned out to be layoff announcements, too many urgent procedures that turned out to be cost-cutting measures. They don't trust emergency communications unless they understand the complete context." The radio crackled with a transmission that made Daniel's blood run cold. "Central Command, this is Patrol 3. I'm hearing what sounds like metal grinding against metal coming from the Southwest Foundation area. The sound is getting louder and more frequent. I think we're looking at active structural failure." Daniel felt military training take over as civilian considerations became secondary to immediate life safety requirements. "All stations, this is emergency coordination. Implement immediate evacuation of Southwest Quadrant. This is not precautionary. This is emergency evacuation due to active structural failure. Move personnel immediately." But even as Daniel broadcast emergency evacuation orders, he could hear the confused responses that revealed how corporate bureaucracy was undermining emergency response effectiveness. Floor wardens were asking for written authorization. Department heads were demanding documentation. Security personnel were requesting credential verification. While buildings showed signs of imminent collapse, corporate culture was creating exactly the kind of decision paralysis that transformed manageable emergencies into catastrophic disasters. Daniel was about to discover that his biggest challenge wouldn't be coordinating complex logistics or managing technical emergency procedures. His biggest challenge would be overcoming organizational systems that prioritized administrative compliance over human survival and corporate cultures that had taught people to question emergency procedures rather than implement them immediately. As structural failure indicators accelerated and evacuation delays mounted, Daniel realized that saving 15,000 lives would require not just military expertise in emergency coordination, but also the ability to cut through corporate bureaucracy that was literally endangering the people it was designed to protect. The breakthrough came at 7:23 a.m. when Jennifer Walsh burst into conference room 3901 carrying a tablet that displayed building security footage showing something that changed everything. Her face was pale with a mixture of vindication and horror. as she approached Daniel's improvised command station, where he was coordinating evacuation procedures through increasingly frantic radio communications. "Daniel, you need to see this," Walsh said, her voice tight with urgency. "Building security cameras in the Southwest Foundation area captured something that proves everything you've been saying about structural failure." Daniel looked up from the radio coordination he was managing. His attention split between Walsh's discovery and the continuing reports of evacuation delays throughout the complex. "What kind of footage?" Walsh set the tablet on the conference table and played video surveillance from the underground parking garage. The timestamp showed 6:15 a.m., just 30 minutes before Daniel had entered conference room 3901 with his warnings about structural failure. The grainy security footage showed what appeared to be a normal parking garage level, but as Daniel watched, he could see subtle movements in the ceiling structure that his engineering background helped him recognize as active deflection under load. "Watch the support beam in the center of the frame," Walsh said, pointing to a specific area of the video. "The security system flags unusual movement, and you can see the beam actually shifting position over the course of 15 minutes. Daniel studied the footage with growing alarm. The support beam showed clear deflection patterns that indicated load-bearing failure in progress. This wasn't theoretical structural assessment or engineering speculation. This was real-time documentation of building collapse in slow motion. "There's more," Walsh continued, advancing the video timeline. "This footage is from 7:10 a.m., just 15 minutes ago." The later footage showed the same parking garage area, but the structural deterioration had accelerated dramatically. Support. Beams that had shown subtle movement in the earlier footage now displayed visible sagging. Ceiling panels had separated from their mounting systems. Most alarmingly, hairline cracks in the foundation walls had widened into obvious fractures that were allowing water infiltration. "Jesus," Daniel breathed, his military experience helping him recognize the visual indicators of imminent catastrophic failure. "This building is coming down, not eventually, soon, maybe within hours." Amanda Foster appeared at Daniel's shoulder, studying the security footage with the expression of someone watching her worst fears confirmed. "How long do we have?" Daniel's engineering background helped him analyze the progression of structural failure shown in the security footage. "Based on the acceleration rate between these two timestamps, I'd estimate we have somewhere between 2 and 6 hours before catastrophic failure. But that's assuming linear progression, which isn't how building collapse works. Structural failure can accelerate exponentially once critical load-bearing elements reach failure threshold. The security footage provided the objective evidence that had been missing from Daniel's warnings about structural failure, but it also revealed how close they were to disaster. While corporate executives had spent precious time debating his credentials and authority, the buildings had continued deteriorating toward collapse that would affect thousands of people. "This footage needs to go to every department head immediately," Amanda Foster said, with decisive authority. "People who are questioning evacuation orders need to see visual proof that this emergency is real." But as Walsh began distributing the security footage to department heads throughout the complex, Daniel realized that visual evidence of structural failure created new challenges for evacuation coordination. People who had been skeptical about emergency procedures were now potentially facing panic as they understood the magnitude of danger they were in. The radio crackled with increasingly frantic communications as news of the security footage spread. Through the organization, "Central Command, this is Floor Warden 15. Personnel are asking if the structural failure footage means immediate collapse is imminent. They want to know if they have time to collect personal belongings or if they need to evacuate immediately without anything." Daniel recognized the communication challenge that accompanied transition from skepticism to panic during emergency situations. Military training had taught him that effective crisis management required maintaining calm urgency, moving people quickly without creating dangerous crowd dynamics. Floor Warden 15, this is emergency coordination, Daniel responded. Personnel should evacuate immediately with only essential personal items. Emphasize that evacuation is urgent but manageable if people follow established procedures. We have time to evacuate safely, but not time for extended personal preparation. But the security footage was creating exactly the kind of accelerated evacuation pressure that Daniel had been trying to avoid. Throughout the complex, employees who had been questioning emergency procedures were now rushing toward exits without coordination, creating potential bottlenecks at stairwells and exit points. Marcus Webb appeared at Daniel's command station with radio reports that confirmed his fears about panic evacuation replacing coordinated evacuation. Rodriguez, I'm getting reports of crowding at stairwells in the southwest quadrant. People saw the structural footage and decided to evacuate immediately without waiting for coordination from floor wardens. Daniel felt military training engage as he recognized the transition from organized evacuation to potentially dangerous crowd movement. Mr. Webb, we need immediate crowd control at all major exit points. People evacuating without coordination create exactly the kind of bottlenecks that cause trampling casualties. My security team is already repositioning to manage crowd flow, Webb replied, his professional skepticism about Daniel's authority replaced by recognition that expertise was more important than credentials during actual emergencies. But we're dealing with people who went from questioning whether evacuation was necessary to believing that building collapse is imminent. The radio filled with overlapping transmissions as security personnel throughout the complex reported crowding, confusion, and increasingly urgent requests for guidance. Central Command, I've got approximately 300 people trying to evacuate through stairwell C simultaneously. This is becoming dangerous. Daniel realized that the security footage, while providing necessary evidence of structural failure, had accelerated evacuation timelines beyond the carefully coordinated procedures he had been implementing. People who understood the visual reality of building collapse were no longer willing to wait for organized evacuation protocols. All security stations, this is emergency coordination, Daniel broadcast on the primary frequency. Implement immediate crowd control at all stairwells and exit points. Priority is preventing bottlenecks and maintaining orderly flow. Use floor wardens to establish staging areas that prevent overwhelming of exit routes. But crowd control during accelerated evacuation required more personnel than Titan Financial Group's security team could provide. Daniel realized that effective emergency response would require converting willing employees into temporary crowd management personnel using principles he had learned during military evacuation operations. Mr. Webb, Daniel said, we need to identify employees with leadership experience who can serve as temporary crowd coordination personnel. Military veterans, emergency responders, people with coaching or teaching backgrounds, anyone with experience, managing groups under pressure. Webb was already coordinating with human resources to identify personnel with relevant background experience. Walsh is pulling employee records for anyone with military service, emergency response training, or leadership roles that might qualify them for crowd management assistance. Jennifer Walsh reappeared with a tablet showing employee database searches that revealed more resources than Daniel had expected. We've identified 47 employees with military service, 23 with emergency response training through volunteer fire departments or EMT certification, and 68 with coaching, teaching, or group leadership experience. Daniel felt a surge of optimism as he realized that Titan Financial Group's employee base included significant, untapped expertise in emergency management. Ms. Walsh, we need to contact these people immediately and request voluntary assistance. With evacuation coordination, military veterans will understand emergency procedures. Emergency responders will know crowd management techniques. The identification of employees with relevant emergency experience created opportunities for distributed leadership that could address the coordination challenges created by accelerated evacuation timelines. Instead of trying to manage 15,000 people through a small security team, Daniel could leverage existing expertise throughout the employee population. Central Command, this is Floor Warden 20, came a radio transmission that revealed how employee expertise was already emerging organically. I've got a former Marine sergeant on this floor who's helping organize evacuation procedures. He's implementing buddy system protocols and establishing accountability procedures that are working better than our standard evacuation plans. Daniel recognized the natural tendency for military veterans to assume leadership roles during emergency situations, but he also realized that effective coordination required integrating volunteer leadership with official emergency response procedures. Floor Warden 20, this is emergency coordination, Daniel responded. Coordinate with the Marine sergeant to establish formal liaison role. We need his expertise integrated with our overall evacuation coordination, not operating independently. But the emergence of distributed leadership among employees with emergency experience created new coordination challenges. Throughout the complex, veterans, emergency responders, and people with leadership backgrounds were implementing their own evacuation procedures based on their training and experience, sometimes conflicting with the centralized coordination Daniel was trying to maintain. The radio crackled with reports that revealed both the benefits and challenges of distributed emergency leadership. Central Command, this is Security Patrol 9. I've got a former EMT who's established a medical triage station for employees with mobility limitations. She's coordinating with a retired fire captain who's managing stairwell traffic flow. They're asking for integration with official emergency procedures. Daniel realized that effective crisis management required balancing centralized coordination with decentralized expertise. Military training had taught him that successful emergency response often depended on empowering qualified personnel to make local decisions while maintaining overall strategic coordination. Security Patrol 9, this is emergency coordination, Daniel replied. Integrate the EMT and fire captain into official coordination structure. They have authority to implement local procedures that support overall evacuation objectives. Amanda Foster had been monitoring the radio traffic with growing appreciation for the employee expertise that was emerging during the crisis. Daniel, it sounds like we have more emergency management capability among our employees than we realized. Maybe this evacuation can work after all, but Daniel's military experience warned him that distributed leadership during emergencies required careful coordination to prevent conflicts between different approaches to crisis management. Ma'am, we need to establish clear authority structures that integrate volunteer expertise with official procedures. Too many independent leaders can create coordination problems that undermine evacuation effectiveness. The radio transmitted a report that confirmed Daniel's concerns about coordination challenges. Central Command, this is Floor Warden 12. I've got two different groups implementing different evacuation procedures. A former Army officer is using military protocols, while a retired fire captain is using civilian emergency procedures. They're giving conflicting instructions about evacuation routes and timing. Daniel felt familiar frustration about the coordination challenges that emerged when different emergency response backgrounds collided during actual crises. Military protocols emphasize speed and compliance. Civilian emergency protocols emphasize safety and consensus. Both approaches had merit, but they required integration rather than competition. Floor Warden 12. This is emergency coordination. Daniel broadcast. Establish immediate coordination meeting between the Army officer and fire captain. Their expertise needs to be integrated, not competing. Overall evacuation success requires unified procedures, not parallel systems. But as Daniel worked to coordinate distributed leadership among employees with emergency experience, the radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. Central Command, this is Patrol 16. I'm in the Southwest Foundation area, and I'm seeing what looks like active water main rupture flooding the foundation space. The structural deterioration is accelerating beyond anything we've seen before. Daniel felt military training engage as he processed the implications of water main rupture in an already compromised foundation system. Water infiltration would accelerate structural failure exponentially, reducing the time frame for safe evacuation from hours to potentially minutes. All stations, this is emergency coordination. Daniel broadcast with the urgency of someone who understood that crisis situations could accelerate beyond all planning. Structural failure timeline has accelerated due to water system compromise. Implement immediate emergency evacuation of all underground levels and southwest quadrant. This is no longer precautionary. This is life-critical emergency evacuation. As Daniel coordinated emergency response to accelerating structural failure, he realized that all the authority questions, credential debates, and organizational resistance that had consumed precious time were now irrelevant. The buildings were failing faster than anyone had predicted, and the only thing that mattered was getting people out before catastrophic collapse occurred. The invisible janitor had become the visible crisis coordinator, not through corporate promotion or organizational recognition, but through the simple reality that expertise was more important than hierarchy when lives were at stake. The evacuation reached its climactic phase at 8:47 a.m. when the Southwest Quadrant's foundation finally succumbed to the relentless pressure of structural failure and water infiltration. Daniel was coordinating the final stages of personnel evacuation when the building's death rattle began. A deep, resonant groaning that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the structure itself, audible even 40 floors above the compromised foundation. All personnel, this is emergency coordination, Daniel broadcast on every available frequency, his voice carrying the calm authority he had learned to project during combat situations when panic could kill more effectively than enemy fire. Building. Collapse is imminent in the Southwest Quadrant. Implement immediate emergency evacuation of all remaining personnel. This is not a drill. This is not precautionary. This is active structural failure. The radio exploded with overlapping transmissions as the reality of catastrophic building failure transformed theoretical emergency procedures into desperate race against time. Security personnel, floor wardens, and volunteer coordinators throughout the complex reported their evacuation status with voices that carried increasing urgency as the building's structural distress became audible to everyone. Emergency coordination. This is Floor Warden 27, came a voice tight with controlled panic. Southwest corner offices are showing visible wall movement. I can see cracks opening in real time. We've got 12 people still evacuating from this section. Daniel felt the familiar compression of time that accompanied genuine life-or-death situations. Military experience had taught him that building collapse created narrow windows of opportunity where seconds determined survival. Outcomes. Floor Warden 27, Evacuate those 12 people immediately via east stairwells. Do not use southwest evacuation routes. Move now. But even as Daniel coordinated final evacuation procedures, he could hear through the radio traffic that distributed leadership among employees with emergency experience was proving more effective than centralized command structure could have achieved. Former military personnel, retired emergency responders, and people with leadership backgrounds were implementing local solutions that addressed specific evacuation challenges with expertise that no single coordinator could have provided. Emergency coordination. This is Sergeant Martinez, former Marines, came a transmission that exemplified the natural leadership emerging throughout the crisis. I've got 37 personnel from floors 15 through 18 consolidated in East Stairwell. We're implementing buddy system accountability and coordinated descent to prevent bottlenecks. Estimated completion time, 8 minutes. Daniel recognized the military efficiency that characterized Sergeant Martinez's approach, but he also appreciated how civilian employees were adapting to emergency procedures that required cooperation rather than compliance. Sergeant Martinez, excellent coordination. Maintain accountability protocols and report when your group reaches ground-level evacuation zones. Jennifer Walsh appeared at Daniel's command station with a tablet displaying real-time evacuation, tracking data that revealed the scope of coordination success they were achieving. Daniel, we've evacuated 2,200 people successfully. We have approximately 800 personnel remaining in the complex, concentrated primarily in the northwest quadrant, away from the structural failure area. The numbers represented more than statistical success. They represented thousands of lives preserved through emergency coordination that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Daniel felt a moment of professional satisfaction that was immediately overshadowed by recognition that 800 people still remained in buildings, showing signs of imminent collapse. Ms. Walsh, we need final sweep coordination to ensure no personnel are left behind during evacuation, Daniel replied, while monitoring multiple radio frequencies for reports of stragglers, people with mobility limitations, or anyone who might need assistance reaching evacuation routes. But the final evacuation phase revealed challenges that no amount of planning could have anticipated. Throughout the complex, employees were making personal decisions about evacuation that reflected individual circumstances, family obligations, and economic considerations that military emergency response never had to accommodate. Emergency coordination. This is Floor Warden 41, came a transmission that revealed the human complexity of civilian evacuation. I've got 6 people who are refusing to evacuate because they're concerned about leaving work computers with confidential client information. They want written authorization that they won't be held liable for data security breaches if they abandon their workstations. Daniel felt disbelief that bordered on rage at the corporate mentality that prioritized data security over personal survival during building collapse. Floor Warden 41, inform those personnel that data security is irrelevant if they're dead. They need to evacuate immediately, or they'll become casualties of their own administrative obsessions. But the radio response revealed that corporate culture created evacuation obstacles that military experience had never prepared Daniel to address. Emergency coordination. These employees are saying they'd rather risk building collapse than face lawsuits for data security violations. They're asking for written indemnification from legal liability before they'll abandon their workstations. Amanda Foster, who had been monitoring the evacuation coordination from her position near Daniel's command station, took the radio with an expression of executive authority that cut through corporate bureaucracy like military command authority, cut through battlefield confusion. This is CEO Amanda Foster speaking to all remaining personnel. You have immediate authorization to abandon workstations. leave confidential materials, ignore data security protocols, and prioritize personal survival over any corporate policy. Anyone who remains in these buildings will be considered to have violated direct executive orders to preserve their own lives. The CEO's intervention provided the administrative authorization that some employees needed to overcome corporate conditioning that prioritized policy compliance over personal safety, but it also revealed how civilian emergency response required addressing psychological barriers that didn't exist in military operations. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent reports as the building's structural failure accelerated beyond all previous timelines. Emergency coordination. This is Patrol 22. I'm seeing active collapse progression in the Southwest Foundation. Support beams are failing in sequence. The collapse zone is expanding beyond the original failure area. Daniel's engineering background helped him recognize that sequential failure of load-bearing elements indicated progressive collapse that could affect the entire building complex. Buildings experiencing this type of failure could transition from partial collapse to total collapse within minutes rather than hours. All remaining personnel, this is emergency coordination. Daniel broadcast with maximum urgency. Progressive. Collapse is in progress. Evacuate immediately via any available route. Speed is now more important than coordination. Get out now. But even as Daniel issued emergency evacuation orders that prioritized speed over coordination, he could hear through radio traffic that the distributed leadership structure they had developed was maintaining evacuation effectiveness even under extreme time pressure. Emergency coordination. This is Captain Williams, retired fire department, came a transmission that demonstrated how professional emergency experience was adapting to building collapse conditions. I've got final sweep teams checking floors, 30 through 40 for stragglers. We're implementing rapid accountability procedures and emergency evacuation via service elevators that are still operational. The decision to use service elevators during building collapse violated standard emergency procedures, but Daniel recognized that extreme situations required accepting calculated risks to achieve evacuation objectives. Captain Williams, approved. For service elevator evacuation, if stairwells are compromised, maintain radio contact and abort if elevator systems show failure indicators. Marcus Webb appeared at Daniel's command station with security reports that confirmed the success of evacuation procedures that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Rodriguez, we've got confirmation that 14,847 personnel have reached designated evacuation zones outside the building complex. Final sweep teams report approximately 50 people remaining in the northwest quadrant. The evacuation numbers represented extraordinary success in emergency coordination, but Daniel's military experience warned him that final evacuation phases often produced casualties among people who delayed evacuation until building failure made escape impossible. Mr. Webb, we need immediate helicopter evacuation capability for personnel who might be trapped by progressive collapse, Daniel said, his mind automatically engaging contingency planning that military training had taught him to maintain even during successful operations. Helicopter evacuation, Webb's expression revealed how far beyond normal corporate emergency procedures they had moved. We're talking about urban helicopter operations during building collapse. That's military-level emergency response. Mr. Webb, we're facing military-level emergency conditions, Daniel replied. Progressive building collapse in urban environments requires emergency response capabilities that exceed normal civilian procedures. But as Daniel coordinated contingency planning for worst-case evacuation scenarios, the radio transmitted reports that confirmed their evacuation success was preventing the catastrophic casualties that progressive building collapse normally produced. Emergency coordination. "This is Lieutenant Rodriguez, Army National Guard," came a transmission from someone whose military background was providing final coordination for evacuation completion. "Final sweep complete for floors 25 through 40. 0 personnel remaining in designated danger zones. All remaining stragglers are in northwest quadrant, away from collapse progression." Daniel felt a surge of professional satisfaction, mixed with exhaustion, as the scope of their evacuation success became clear. They had moved almost 15,000 people safely out of buildings experiencing active structural failure, using emergency coordination procedures that combined military efficiency with civilian cooperation. Amanda Foster stood near the conference room windows, watching streams of employees gathering in designated evacuation zones across the street from the Titan financial complex. Her expression mixed relief at evacuation success, with recognition that her company was facing fundamental changes that would reshape everything about their corporate operations. "Daniel," she said quietly, "how long before we know if the buildings are completely lost?" Daniel studied the building schematics that showed progressive collapse spreading through the southwest quadrant, while structural engineers conducted emergency assessment of the remaining sections. "Ma'am, based on the collapse progression and foundation compromise, I'd estimate we're looking at partial loss of the southwest quadrant with potential total loss depending on how much of the foundation system fails. And rebuilding timeline? Months for assessment, years for reconstruction, assuming the site remains viable for rebuilding," Daniel replied. "But the important thing is that we evacuated everyone before catastrophic failure occurred. Buildings can be replaced. People can't." Jennifer Walsh appeared with final evacuation statistics that confirmed the extraordinary success of emergency procedures that had seemed impossible when Daniel first entered conference room 3901. Final count: 14,953 personnel evacuated successfully. 0 casualties, 0 injuries, 0 people unaccounted for. The numbers represented more than operational success. They represented validation of emergency coordination principles that Daniel had learned through 8 years of military service and had finally been able to implement in civilian crisis management. As the morning sun illuminated the evacuation zones where thousands of Titan Financial Group employees gathered safely outside their compromised workplace, Daniel realized that his transformation from invisible janitor to emergency coordinator represented more than personal career advancement. His story demonstrated that expertise existed in unexpected places, that military experience translated to civilian crisis management, and that sometimes the most important qualifications for leadership were competence and character rather than credentials and corporate hierarchy. The shy cleaner who had accidentally entered the wrong conference room had accidentally discovered his true calling as someone who could bridge the gap between military efficiency and civilian cooperation, creating emergency response capabilities that neither approach could achieve independently. But as Daniel watched thousands of employees who owed their lives to evacuation procedures he had coordinated, he also realized that his journey from invisible to indispensable was just beginning. Crisis management success had revealed capabilities that corporate America desperately needed, and there was no going back to the safety of anonymity. The invisible veteran had become visible not through self-promotion or corporate politics, but through the simple reality that competence matters more than credentials when lives are at stake, and that authentic leadership emerges from service rather than status. As emergency responders arrived to assess the building collapse and coordinate ongoing safety operations, Daniel prepared to transition from crisis coordinator back to whatever role his transformed relationship with Titan Financial Group would require. But he knew that regardless of titles or organizational charts, he had found his purpose in bridging military expertise with civilian needs. creating emergency response capabilities that could protect people when conventional systems failed. The accidental hero had discovered that sometimes the most important accidents were the ones that revealed who we really were when everything else fell apart. 6 months later, Daniel Rodriguez stood in the gleaming conference room of Titan Financial Group's temporary headquarters. But this time, he wasn't there to clean. The nameplate on the table read, Daniel Rodriguez, Director of Emergency Preparedness and Crisis Management, and around the table sat executives from 12 major corporations who had come to learn from the man who had saved 15,000 lives. The key to effective emergency response, Daniel explained to the assembled executives, isn't having perfect credentials. It's having the courage to act when action matters more than approval. Amanda Foster smiled from her position at the head of the table. Titan Financial Group had not only survived the crisis, but had emerged stronger, becoming the industry leader in emergency preparedness consulting. The company that had once ignored expert warnings now led the field in crisis management. Innovation. Mr. Rodriguez, asked the CEO of Metropolitan Insurance, what would you say to organizations that think military experience isn't relevant to corporate challenges? Daniel thought of that pre-dawn morning when he had stood outside conference room 3901, invisible and uncertain. I'd say that leadership isn't about where you come from. It's about where you're willing to go when people need you most. The building collapse had been contained to the southwest quadrant, exactly as Daniel had predicted. The evacuation had achieved 0 casualties, becoming a case study taught in business schools and emergency management programs worldwide. But for Daniel, the real victory wasn't professional recognition. It was the knowledge that sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as wrong turns that led to exactly where you needed to be. If Daniel's journey from invisible to indispensable inspired you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what hidden talents you might be overlooking in yourself or others. Subscribe for more stories that prove heroism comes in the most unexpected packages. And remember, sometimes the person who changes everything is the one nobody sees coming. Your next dose of inspiration is just one click away.